Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm very happy to be here at this, urgent discussion on not just press freedom, but empowering people in their countries through our news, our real news. I want to first make a reminder, we're gonna take questions this session, and you can send your questions to #RSFindex, and we hope to get to them at the end, or actually we'll intersperse them. So now, I'm Dana Priest at the Washington. I've been here for many years. I now teach journalism also at the University of Maryland. And I'd like to introduce the people with me. This is Jesús Esquivel. He is the Washington correspondent for Proceso, and probably the leading expert on Mexican drug cartels. This is Alisa Sopova. She is a journalist from Ukraine, and she's here in the United States on a fellowship at Harvard University. Welcome. And our very special guest, Jason Rezaian, who wasn't here last year. Oh boy. Jason was our correspondent in Iran until 2016, when he was arrested and spent 544 days in prison. Now he's a global opinion editor here. And very, welcome. I'll get it together. And finally, Margaret Talev, who's the Washington chief correspondent at the White House for Bloomberg News, and also the president of the White House Correspondents Association, so probably the person who has to deal with the White House the most on behalf of the press corps. So very happy to have you here. I'm sorry that you have to be here. Okay, so I wanted to start with Jason because he wasn't here before when we had this last year. And, if you could just talk briefly about what it's like to be here and what it's like to now have a president who's not a fan of yours or ours.
I think, first and foremost, I'm really happy to be back to work. I started back here at the Post in January, and I never expected that I'd be writing so much about press freedom issues around the world. I didn't think that there would be the need when I came out of prison in Iran. I didn't expect the sort of combative environment that we experience now in town, but it feels right to be writing about these issues and having the opportunity to lend my voice to what I think is a very important problem. I'm glad that RSF continues their great work, but as we know, the situation continues to devolve around the world. So hopefully our collective efforts can create a better environment for our colleagues around the world.
Yep. And Alisa, you as a Ukrainian, you know well Russian disinformation, or just disinformation by a state that is trying to sway public opinion and consolidate power. Can you talk a little bit about the efforts in Ukraine that we might use here to identify truly fake news and disinformation? I mean, a lot of us here are trying to figure out how do we get out of this bizarre situation where people actually use the word fake when it comes to the traditional news media.
Unfortunately, I cannot give you a good advice based on Ukrainian experience. I can give you advice of how you probably should not do based on Ukrainian experience, unfortunately. So, yeah, we know in journalistic circles, we know Ukraine now as like first ground for Russia to do all this massive informational attack. And the big danger for journalism is that when you see the informational space being bombarded with all this bizarre stuff, the first reaction that often in our case occurs is that you try to counterbalance this not with some objective, good, truthful reporting, but with something that you believe is good for your side. So if Russia is saying this, we just should say the opposite, even if it's not true. For example, right now we are having sort of a scandal connected with the illegal detention centers in Ukraine, which Amnesty International has written in its report, and it was proven that it exists in Ukraine, that they're detaining people whom they assume are connected with separatists and keep them illegally. And then Hromadska TV channel made a documentary about it. And now there is a whole shitstorm these authors of this documentary are facing.
Yes.
Because if you are reporting on something wrong Ukrainian government is doing, if it is true, it is viewed as a treason. So like you should only you should report for the sake and for the good of your country, or like in some other case for like your side. So I think there is in these situations when there is a lot of pressure from one side, it's very important to be careful to not fall for the other extreme, but to try to like keep being a good journalist, not just to fight with some other side.
Yep. And I was thinking of organizations like Stop Fake, which is has an English version, which was really on the front line of identifying disinformation and sharing it with the public as such. Jesus, your situation is similar in the sense that reporters get killed, but not similar in the sense that it's usually perpetrated by drug cartels and their friends in power in the government. So, do the drug cartels in that sense share the same goal as some of the authoritarian political leaders? What are they trying to do by killing journalists?
Well, absolutely. They're trying to close the door to the truth about their business and their relationship with the government, with the politicians, local police, and the federal government. It's too sad to be a reporter of Mexico, the second deadliest country in the world to do journalism after Syria, and to see that when a colleague has been arrested or disappeared or killed, the federal government don't care. You have to use the power of the social media, the people, to go to the streets, to organize a protest in order to get the attention of the authorities to that. Last year, 12 journalists were killed in Mexico.
Yeah.
So far this year, 3. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing being done by the government that, to us, journalists, satisfy what their investigations are doing. We don't believe in the investigations by the government about the killings of journalists. And believe me, the drug cartels are taking advantage of that.
Yeah.
You've been in the border, and you know what I'm talking about.
So how do you see any light in this darkness?
There is always hope.
Yeah.
And we are hoping that the next president of Mexico, we're going to have elections on July 1st, is going at least to put more attention to the issue. So far, I can tell you, sadly, there is no hope until the new president arrives to Mexico and see what offers to us.
Yeah. It's really astonishing that this is right next door.
It is.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Margaret, it was sort of unthinkable that we would have an American reporter here representing American reporters.
Yeah.
You know, can you talk a little bit about how the administration's attitude toward the press has actually affected people overseas, both the people that are close to the president and reporters overseas?
That's a great question. I do think when we talk about the administration's impact on the safety of journalists, that there's two ways to look at it, and one is the relative safety of being an American political reporter and whether that's changed, and the second is its impact overseas. And I think the impact has been stronger overseas, or is potentially more threatening overseas. Early in the administration, domestically, you could feel the tension ratcheted up at some events that you were covering, political rallies, for example. There were a number of times when I or some of my fellow colleagues just didn't feel safe. It seemed like a situation where the crowd was whipped up and things could turn quickly, and that's not normal for being a journalist covering politics. There's always, across partisan lines, been a wide acceptance that reporters are in the room to get the sense of the crowd and to share that information with people, and that's of value. So that's worrisome, and the kind of threats that are mostly social media rhetoric, but often beyond the pale, that has ratcheted up. And inside our membership, the WHCA has created a committee this year on reporter safety, so that people can, it's voluntary, but so that they can come report to the board if they've been threatened or how they've been threatened, and whether it's something they need to contact the authorities. That's like a new mechanism that we've set up, and it doesn't, I don't feel great telling you that, but it's true, and hopefully it's been of service. But there is an impact overseas also that does concern me, and it is the part of the way that U.S. presidents have always kind of construed the rhetoric about the free press and the First Amendment is to signal to other countries that freedom of the press is kind of one of those pillars of a rule of law society that the U.S. Wants to encourage and on some level expects. And even if it's not a direct threat, the idea that aid could in some way be tied to this, that expectations and U.S. alliances revolve around it, the thought has been it at least has some potential positive effect, right? I mean, does the U.S. have alliances with countries where press freedoms are not protected? Yes. Has that existed with past presidents from both parties? Yes, of course it has. So we all know that. But it's different to stand side by side with a leader known for repressive and violent tactics and laugh at jokes that aren't funny, then about
assassinating reporters.
Yes, that's right. And so it's tremendously troubling. But it's something that personally I worry about a lot, and that our members worry about a lot also. You asked another question too, which is about the attitudes of the administration toward the press, and I think that's a more complicated question. I really do. I think there's a real range inside every administration, and it's true of this one also, about the people who, from the career employees to the political appointees, how they feel about the press. And there are many inside every administration, including this one, who believe that the press is a fundamental part of democracy and needs to be protected, and that there needs to be an open and honest working relationship with the press, because the press represents the public and it's a major component of democracy. I don't want to speak for the president. I can't get inside his head. I am not convinced that he wishes ill things or violence on anyone in the press corps. It's not my sense that that's the metric by which he makes his decisions. I also don't have any reason to believe that he feels that it is his responsibility to protect us or to champion us here or overseas. I just don't, he has not demonstrated that he thinks about it in those terms. And when you're interacting with the president or top officials in a journalistic capacity, off camera, behind the scenes, the relations are often very cordial and are often successful in terms of asking something and getting an answer back or having a dialogue. What you see on the camera is what's actually happening is a lot more complicated than that, but what the public sees, what foreign governments see, what foreign leaders see is important too, and that's what worries me a lot.
Thank you, and I wanted to follow up with all of you on death threats. I mean, it is the first time, I think, that there are many reporters who cover the White House in particular and cover the campaign who actually received death threats and took them seriously enough to go to their company's security people and that sort of thing?
And the Secret Service and the FBI and local police authorities, absolutely.
Do you know of any actual arrests or people who were visited by the FBI or law enforcement to make sure that they were not serious?
Yeah, that's a great question, but I can't really speak to it from here.
Okay.
But I think what we have encouraged all of our members who receive any kind of threat that chills them or worries them, that they take beyond just someone spouting off on an email who they'll never meet is to go ahead and contact the Secret Service, the FBI, the police, the White House, to let them know, to report it, to reach out to CPJ, to add it to that database that's being kept on a national level, because you cannot address the problem without documenting it, and we're now all in an era where we're documenting it.
And so Margaret's referring to Press Tracker, which is documenting all the arrests, the assaults, and things like that against journalists in the United States. Could I ask the three of you also about death threats? I mean, is it that there's just certain reporters that governments don't like the personality, or what is it that why do certain reporters that you have known get death threats? And Jason, I don't know if there's actually been reporters who are killed. They're usually countries either in prison or they kill. So I guess threats of imprisonment. Why are certain reporters targeted?
Well, I know various colleagues in Mexico that have received death threats, and some have then been killed. Without naming, I want to talk about a colleague who was doing stories about the federal government trying to control the advertisement on the media in order to get more control of what the newspapers, the radio and TV stations
So this is
doing.
Publicly funded advertisements?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
There is also a law in Mexico that's going to be start hopefully soon. This reporter gets some documents about the amounts of money the federal government was spending on that advertisement. And he went, after receiving the documents, he started talking to his editor about to publish the story. That night he went to his apartment to sleep. And then his phone started ringing with not recognizing the number that was calling. And he get a call and said, "Your mother is in a taxi cab." And his mother is 80-something years old. I'm talking about 11 p.m. And then another call and said, "If you don't give up the documents, your mother is going to be dead." And he was calling home to find out about her mother. And her mother was asleep. So he went out, and next day, he went to work. When he get back, the documents, personal computer, another stuff in his apartment disappear. And then he reported to the police, to the authorities, the police, and they went, they trying to help to find something. Nothing. The Mexican police in Mexico is just a waste of time.
Yeah.
And the cameras outside the building find out it was a car parking in front of his apartment. And he started looking to the plates and everything on the car. And he has his own resources, and he found out it was like our CIA agents. It's called CISEN in Mexico, looking to his apartment. So he went directly to see him at the car and said, "You know, I lost my computer and personal stuff last night." And he said, "And what do you think? I am a policeman or something? That I work for the government?" "Yes, you do. What are you doing here?" And he says, "Just making sure that you don't publish what you plan to publish."
Yeah.
That give you an example of what's the pressure Mexican journalists live up. But very quickly, in terms of politicians with real power or drug cartels, they don't threaten you. If they want to stop you, they're going to kill you anywhere. And they do that. We have proofs of that, 112.
And it's mainly because you're reporting on their
activities.
trafficking, yeah.
Or their relationship with the government or the local police or the state police, because they work together. Otherwise, there should be no narco traffic on the border.
Yeah. Ukraine, in Donbass in particular, there have been reporters who have been murdered. Do they get a warning beforehand? And why have they targeted certain reporters?
Yeah, it depends. After listening to the two previous speakers, I just see how relative everything is. Because I know that journalists in the U.S. feel very threatened, but from my perspective, when I listen to this, I'm like, come on, people, it's it's not that bad.
100%.
But when I listen about journalists in Mexico, I'm like, come on, I have nothing to really complain about. In Ukraine, the whole society is so traumatized and polarized now that basically anyone who speaks up more or less gets some kind of death threats, like everyone. I got one recently too. Mostly not as much from government as from like some random people who dislike what you say, or from these ultra-right groups or whatever. Usually it's not really, it doesn't really mean that they're gonna kill you. But we indeed had a case of journalists being killed in downtown Kyiv as recently as in 2016. It was Pavel Sheremetyev. And still their investigation didn't get to anything, and there is no will to investigate it probably. So
what was she reporting on?
Oh my God, I don't remember that story very well. Yeah, but the problem is that we have two parts of the country that is government control and non-government control. And if on government control side, journalists are still being killed and you can get threats and everything, but on the non-control territory, it's pretty much impossible to report at all. And even though I'm always, because I'm from there and I see that there are like 4 million people living there and nobody basically cares about what's happening to them, I'm always trying to advocate for the idea that we should report somehow on that. But basically, it is impossible. You have to work undercover. You cannot get any access. You have to pretend that you are not journalist, but like you are talking to your neighbors or something. And then if your name appears in some media, it's very, very likely that you will just be like illegally arrested and disappear. There is a bunch of people who are currently
And you're talking about the Russian occupied areas of Eastern
yes, but it's like not Russia who officially takes responsibility for that, right? So there are these guys who obviously consult with Russia on what they're doing, but pretty much I'm sure they take decisions on whom to detain on that level by themselves.
I think it's worth mentioning also that it's so much easier today to transmit information and images than it's ever been before, even in places like Iran, where media and communications are more filtered and limited than they are in other places. So I think it becomes harder for people in power or organized crime to disrupt the process of getting messages out. And really, it's sort of a war of attrition. You know, they're going to keep doing whatever they need to do to, as Jesus said, stop somebody from getting their message out. And the stakes invariably become higher and higher.
But it's just interesting. I mean, I think in the U.S., and this is, because in the U.S. this is still largely a debate of ideas. It's not the same degree of life and death on any level as it is in Mexico or in Ukraine. There is, on the one hand, with the proliferation of social media tools, any person, no matter what their day job is, no matter where they live, can be acting as a journalist in terms of spreading information. And yet the debate in Washington has often been about what the press as kind of a business entity wants or expects in terms of freedoms or in terms of protection. The one thing that I think is really important for journalists to emphasize, because there's obviously in America there's a disconnect between large segments of society and journalists feeling that we're representing all Americans, that we are the public, that we are just a segment of the public whose job it is to share news and information. That there's a disconnect and a feeling like the press is like a business entity. And when we're talking about the First Amendment or press protections and why it's important, it really is to protect everyone, because the distance from whether a journalist gets diminished or in trouble for sharing critical information and whether a member of the public loses their freedoms for questioning government or sharing critical information. It seems unimaginable in America. It seems like, of course, the public can always criticize their government. It's, you know, a fundamental part of what being an American is about. But in so many other places around the world, that is just like, you're just an average person sitting at home around the dinner table and are afraid to talk about what you really think, to raise questions, to protest, to ask questions, to support an opposition candidate for fear that you could be jailed, that your family could be punished. It's all the same continuum. It is all the same issues.
Can I add something to that? Yeah. Talking about mechanism to protect journalists in my country, for example, in Mexico, is a joke.
Could you explain it for everybody what it is?
Yeah, we have the government approved a special
bodyguards.
No, not bodyguards. A mechanism that you can call them and say, I've been under a threat or whatever, and they always get late. They don't protect you. And the other effect of that is sometimes you don't need to receive a real death threat by a politician or by a criminal organization. Sorry. You get, for example, a message in your phone and giving you the address of your mother, your brother, and that you know what it is.
You know exactly what it is. Yeah.
And there is also in the small newspapers or radio stations, local. I work for a national magazine, and you've been in one of the small newspapers, local newspapers in the border. There is also the self-censorship.
Sure.
Because you don't want your mother to be killed, your brother, your friend, and you are afraid of them. And you know that if they decide to kill you, they will do it sooner or later. I have cases of friends who they were joking about, oh, they will not touch me. And they heard it.
Yeah. And in Mexico, they have snitches inside the newsroom, and everyone, even the editors-in-chiefs, know who they are, and their role is to make sure that certain things that have to do with the cartel's interests are not published. And so it is actually an open censorship in the sense that no one's hiding this. No one, none of the bad guys are hiding this, which is just remarkable. In Iran, I mean, there's a power play, right, between moderates and hardliners. And in your case, I would assume that the hardliners were behind your arrest, as many arrests.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it looks like. I was taken by the IRGC intelligence unit at a time that, negotiations between the government of Iran and world powers, and including the United States over their nuclear program, was at its height. And, one can only come to the conclusion that it was a highly politicized move, and also one that had the effect of quieting journalists working in Tehran. And I don't think it's any coincidence that, since I was arrested on July 22nd, 2014, the number of Tehran byline stories has decreased dramatically.
Because they saw the message that you got.
Yeah, oftentimes this is about sending a message to other people working in the industry as well.
Do you know whether people who are targeted get a threat to cool it, or is it?
Look, I mean, I think over the years we've seen other journalists in Iran and in other countries be arrested, and oftentimes when you hear their stories afterwards, there was threats to cool it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Margaret, we had a situation just last night, apparently, that the Post's Jose Del Real was barred from an event, a Trump event, and patted down by police. Is this something that you have seen often, the barring of journalists from certain events?
Since the president was inaugurated, and became the president, no, it's really not in terms of credentialing for press events. We have not had a lot of problems during the campaign. Of course, as you all know, there were issues about clearance and who could get into events and who was invited and credentialed to attend events. But the credentialing process at the White House and for White House events has been, for official government events, has been pro forma and involved signups and all the traditions of the past. And
Same with events.
Yeah, but these are issues that part of the association's role is to make sure that there is kind of open and even and fair-handed access to coverage, and that journalists are not, excluded from public events and efforts that should be public by virtue of anything they've done or written. So we always encourage not just members but non-members who are covering any White House to be in touch with us if they have concerns about this kind of thing.
And that was an audience question, so it'd be a good time now to send more questions because we have about 10 minutes left. And with that time, I wanted to try to get us to do some problem solving. And if you could, wave your magic wand and get people to do something that might actually be helpful, what would that be? Starting here in Ukraine, what would that be? What would you want Ukrainians to do, and what would you want Americans to do?
Yeah, that's a great question, because looking at things at places like Ukraine, there is coverage inside of it, and then there is international coverage of it. And speaking of coverage within Ukraine, that would be really very important to try to establish some dialogue between people who disagree on political issues, and not just to try to be journalists on one side and journalists on the other side fighting each other, but to try to ask some questions based on common sense and on what is better for our society generally. And speaking of international coverage, I think there is a sort of a problem that, and for Ukraine it is exactly a problem now, and for many other places probably too, that events, everything is so fast, and this informational environment moves so quickly that things get into fashion and out of fashion very quickly. And so Ukraine got into fashion and everyone was reporting on it, and now everyone forgot about it. And things are still happening and people are still dying every day, and it's still unresolved, and nobody is really interested in reporting about it. Everyone was reporting about the city of Aleppo and what was happening there. What is happening there now? Nobody really knows. Rohingya refugee crisis, also half a year ago, everyone was writing about it. These people are still there and something is happening to them. So I would really encourage my colleagues to sometimes look back at things that we've been covering a few months ago and follow up, not just, drop them after they fall out of fashion.
I think, two things I'd like to say. I think here in the U.S., we can do a better job of leading by example and getting back to some of our previous principles about protecting free expression and supporting it around the world. And, to Alisa's point about continuing coverage on various stories, for me, at this point, I'm looking at a lot of these issues of attacks on the free press around the world. And I've only been at this for 3 months, but there is a very clear through line around the world right now. And I would love to see other journalists here in the U.S. and around the world writing more about this and what it really means, because I think we're still figuring that out.
Yep.
Well, in the case of Mexico, I believe it's a mission impossible in the short term. The problem is the corruption that we have, and to say that we're going to solve the problem in a couple of years of corruption in the government, it's a joke. I don't believe that. But we need the support of the other colleagues, especially from the U.S. I remember Ciudad Juarez a few years ago.
Yep.
Every American journalist wants to be covering Ciudad Juarez, and now nobody talks about Juarez. And as a White House correspondent too, foreign correspondent, I want to tell you something, that we have a group like 30, and you know that? And sometimes we talk about what's the purpose to go to the White House to cover everything. Right. We don't get the chance to ask a question, and if we do, they don't know, they don't care, and they never get back to you. And when your audience asking you, how is to cover the White House? I've been here since 1988, and believe me, I believe the Clinton's administration was so great to be a journalist covering the White House. And in this case, it's I really don't know how to explain how he's covering the White House as a reporter.
And yet this immigration crisis that the president talks a lot about, I mean, isn't that related to the safety issue in Mexico?
It is.
In Central America?
It is, absolutely. But when you analyze what he's talking about, you find out, as a Mexican, as a Central American, or people, U.S. people who live in the border, that he doesn't know what he's talking about. I remember the day after he sworn in the Capitol, I went to Arizona, and I went to Douglas, Arizona. It's a small town right there across Agua Prieta in Mexico, in the state of Sonora. And the mayor, he said, I support the president, I supported Trump. He said, you know, since he started talking about the wall, the Mexicans who cross every day the border to buy stuff right here in my town are left. So we're going to be a ghost town in the next couple of months. And when he's talking about the wall, and I know the border very well, you know, I know. I always look to the Arizona desert and said, oh, this is going to be a good place to have a wall with a name built by Donald Trump. And the drugs crossing in the other side, the Mexicans doing whatever they want. And he doesn't know what is the real importance of the trade in the border.
So more coverage on our side.
Yes. I haven't seen journalists from the national newspapers, the main media in the U.S., going to the border and talking to the people who live in the border. And that's something that I really believe it needs to do in the American media now with this President Donald Trump.
In Ukraine, do you think American media coverage is more sensitive for the, or negative media coverage is more sensitive for the president and the prime minister than Ukrainian coverage? I mean, do we matter anymore to those people in power, and what kind of attention we can bring to them? Because it used to be that was really something that the governments didn't want. They didn't want international coverage of their problems because they all operate in Washington and they all usually need something from Washington.
Yeah, I think it depends on whether the country considers itself like American ally or American enemy. So Ukraine considers itself like a small American ally. So any American coverage means tremendously, and often it's been like anything that is published. It's being translated by different media, in different ways, depending on what they want to hear. They just take some pieces that they want to choose, and then it's being discussed. And it can directly influence the way president behaves or things happen. So it has a huge important influence. And unfortunately, often this like foreign Western coverage focuses more on some big political issues, while it would really help if there was some coverage of like small people who are suffering from the conflict or something.
Yes.
Can I answer the wave the magic wand question? Because you're right. Under the Obama administration, Ben Rhodes, the deputy of the NSC, would convene these background briefings with the Foreign Press Working Group, and it was tremendously valuable for the administration also in helping to explain their policies to the rest of the world. And I think we should be encouraging this administration more to understand the benefits of that. If I could wave a magic wand, there's three things I would do. I would encourage all journalists to spend more time engaging with Americans across the country about what we do and listening to them about what their issues are, what coverage they want. I think there's a disconnect that we have a role in helping to fix. Two, I would encourage all Americans to see these debates about the First Amendment and government embracing dissent as a vital part of democracy. I would encourage people to see that as something that is patriotic and a protection for them, not just for us in a business. And three, I would really encourage the people in any administration who are closest to the president and who understand the impact that this has on the world to be in the president's ear talking about that, whether they are the vice president, the UN ambassador, the defense secretary, the national security advisor. These are really vital issues that do matter for all of our safety and the ability of a free society to excel.
Yep. Well, on that note, we're going to have to wrap. So I want to first make a call out to two organizations that are very important but aren't here, which is Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. and also the Voice of America. You know, it's not known by a lot of people, but both of those organizations are sometimes the last. They employ some of the last reporters who are often in hiding in countries and often take great risks and are in prison themselves in many different places. And I think because you know, the public here doesn't really see those publications as much, we don't know that there are these risks to them. And I wanted to remind the audience here and online that if you'd like to watch video clips from this, you can go to WashingtonPostLive.com and see some excerpts. So thank you for all coming.
Thank you.
And thank you.
I can see you.
It was good.